Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Beijing by China analyst Einar Tangen. He specializes in international politics and economics. And in Washington, D.C., we have Dean Cheng, a senior research fellow at the Asian Studies Center. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Dean, let me begin with you with the move to abolish term limits. Is Xi Jinping going to be president for life?
Well, I'm not sure that he'll be president for life, but it looks like he is setting himself up to be president for a very long time. His current term would end in 2022. The expectation now is that he would therefore stay on for at least a third term through 2027 and quite probably through perhaps 2032 or even 2037.
Okay, so Einar, are we seeing the Chinese leadership becoming more of a one-man show?
No, I think you have to look at this in a historical context. Remember, Deng Xiaoping did something very similar when he realized that in order to push China forward, he needed to make sure that there was a leadership way and also apparatus to make sure that everything occurred according to the plan. Now, remember, Deng, there was no question that he was in control. He not only chose his successor, but then thereafter, he chose his successor's successor. Right. Both Zhang and Hu were chosen by him. So what you have here is, I think Xi believes he has a very strong position in terms of what China needs to do, both to deal with outside threats and also internal threats.
So do you think it's the right decision in order, Einar, to push China forward, as you say?
At this point, I do. I mean, there's some realities to this. Remember, this is a huge organization that you're talking about, 1.4 billion people, and tens and millions of government workers. In order to get the kind of far-reaching changes that he set about in terms of anti-corruption, the poverty, Belt and Road, all of these things which he thinks are crucial to the further development of China, bringing it to a first world power, you have to make sure that the troops believe that you're going to see it through. If they don't believe that, quite frankly, they will turn away from you, or they will just decide that they don't want to get too involved.
Okay, Dean, what do you think? Is it necessary that perhaps China needs more authoritarianism in order to keep itself stable and moving forward?
I'm afraid the argument that you need authoritarianism in order to move things forward, one, can be applied to any and every society. It is essentially an abandonment. It is an argument against democracy. It's an argument against any kind of restraint on political leadership. The reality is that Deng Xiaoping himself actually created or pushed through a restructuring of both the party and the national constitutions to impose term limits, either formally in the constitution for the government or informally within the party leadership. And this was because he and other Chinese leaders of the time saw the dangers of a Mao Zedong, who made exactly these sorts of arguments, that you needed a great helmsman. You needed someone with absolute dictatorial powers in order to see things through. That is the kind of power that also led to things like the Great Leap Forward, one of the worst famines of the 20th century, and the Cultural Revolution, which utterly, destabilized much of Chinese society for over a decade. You need constraints on power, or else, as Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Okay, so Einar, this is an example of those constraints being unknotted, if you like. What happened to checks and balances? He's just going to be surrounded by yes men, right, as he moves forward. That can't be a good thing.
Well, I think you severely underestimate exactly how the Chinese government works forward. This is not a dictatorship of one person. This has to be taken by the Standing Committee, by the Politburo, and it has to be approved. Now, quite frankly, once a decision is made, they do follow generally in lockstep behind it, because that is the system that they have. But, I don't buy into my colleague's argument that, Deng didn't do this. He did wield absolute power. And it's yet to be seen exactly how Xi will handle the power transition after he goes. And calling this authoritarian is a little bit off the mark, given that we don't know exactly what he's going to do. And it's quite possible that he will, as Deng did, unwind a lot of the apparatus that he believes he needs currently in order to get these things through. I don't think you can argue with China's success. And while it is often very nice to talk about, in theory, the practicalities of wielding power, and I'm not in favor of authoritarianism or anything like that, but I wouldn't label it this. He's doing what is necessary. Governments have to provide public safety and the public welfare. If they don't do it, they're a failed government. And we see that around the world in governments that supposedly have these checks and balances.
Okay.
So before we start casting aspersions, I think it's necessary to look carefully at where you're coming from.
And Dean, looking at the system, it appears that at times the party chief and the army chief have more power than the president. So doesn't Einar make a good point here that we're underestimating the Chinese system and kind of seeing it as a monolith?
Well, first off, I would certainly agree that it is not a monolith. But when we examine the consolidation of power that Xi has already done over the last 5 years, the number of leading small groups and other various committees where he is consistently the head, I have to say I'm very impressed by Xi Jinping. The man must sleep no more than 2 hours a night. But also in terms of the likely structuring, we are seeing not so much an unwinding as a reconsolidation of authority towards the top. Xi Jinping has just created, shaped really, a new Politburo and Politburo Standing Committee comprised of people that are going to be loyal to him. I don't see much evidence here that he is brooking dissent. I'm really not sure why we should feel much optimism.
Okay, so Einar, let's remove the word authoritarianism for a moment and let's say undemocratic. Is this proof that you don't have to be democratic in order to be prosperous, in order to be powerful? Because that's been a mantra for many countries around the world. Is China proof that you can be prosperous and not have any democracy?
Well, China has its own form of democracy, and that's the problem. If you go around and you look, the United States, Donald Trump was not elected with the popular vote. He was voted by an anachronistic mechanism called the Electoral College. So we have to be very careful about how we're doing this. What are we judging this against? And in terms of the unwinding, I'm talking about unwinding after he's gotten his agenda through, and that's when he's transitioning power. This is the really, and I would agree with my colleague on this, there is a danger that if he were to transition all of this power to somebody else who was fighting for it, then you could have a real situation. But I think he will follow Deng's example. He will lead with strength at this point and then unwind it as he's transitioning.
Right. So, Dean, you said you respect the man. You said that you're fascinated by him. He must only sleep 2 hours a night. Do you feel, given the current system, given his personality and given his aptitude, that in the foreseeable future, Xi Jinping might just be the leader to take China to superpower status, whether he has checks and balances or not?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think part of this gets us deep into policy issues. One of the real problems that we're seeing, and this is partly related to Xi, but partly related to a broader set of systemic issues, is that we're seeing a significant slowdown, if not rejection, of economic reform. And this actually began under Xi's immediate predecessor, Hu Jintao. We have seen, again, consolidation of economic power in the state, and this is not just within Xi's hands. We have seen a real unwillingness to engage in fundamental necessary economic reforms, whether of the state banking system or state-owned enterprises. This is also beginning to impact China's ability to engage in technological and other innovation. So in the longer term, I'm very mixed about whether or not, regardless of Xi's immediate power seizures, whether or not China can, in fact, make that further leap out of the so-called middle-income trap to a higher status that is really necessary if China truly wants to be a military, economic, and political superpower.
Okay, well, we'll be watching closely. Time will tell. It's a cliche, but only time will tell, indeed. Einar Tangen and Dean Cheng, for the moment, I must thank you both. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.